First, the European Union has today unveiled new legislation aimed at helping the bloc to meet its commitments for the cutting of greenhouse gas emissions by 55% during the course of the next decade. Well, the legislation, which took effect in 2016, includes around a dozen major initiatives, amongst them tougher caps on car pollution, as well as limits on pollution from buildings. Well, foreign companies will also have to face duties for the pollution that they create. Well, let's get more from France 24's Dave Keating in Brussels. Dave, talk us through the main initiatives outlined in this plan.
Well, that 2030 target of a 55% reduction in emissions was already agreed in December. It was raised from the existing target of 40%. So the purpose of this package is to adjust all existing EU climate legislation to take into account that higher target. And that means it's really huge. There are 12 proposals for legislative revisions here, which actually makes it the biggest package of climate legislation proposed by any government anywhere ever. This is really mammoth. But the three key things here, which I think are key because they're going to be the most contentious, is the carbon border tax, or carbon border adjustment mechanism, as the Commission calls it, the move of car emissions and building emissions into an emissions trading system, which will eventually also mean phasing out of combustion engine vehicles, and finally a change to the energy tax directive of the EU. Now, on that first point, that's going to be really controversial. It's designed, that carbon border levy, to avoid the phenomenon of carbon leakage. So companies can't leave the EU, go produce their products outside in a regime that is less stringent, and then import their goods into the EU in order to avoid the EU's climate laws. Now, that's going to be very controversial, particularly with neighboring countries, particularly with Russia. The United States is not a big fan of this either, and there is undoubtedly going to be challenges to this at the WTO. But the Commission says this is sound. It can pass WTO scrutiny because it's being phased in. It's not all at once, and it is not, they insist, a tax. It's a mechanism because the EU is not going to make significant amounts of money from this. The design is to encourage other governments like the United States, like Russia, to up their climate game and match the EU's ambition here. Also, this move of the car emissions into the emissions trading system, giving, for the first time, a price of carbon for emissions from cars. That might seem like something that climate campaigners really welcome, but in fact, they're very worried about this. They really oppose this. And that's because it's going to mean inevitably an increase in fuel duty for consumers. People will be paying more at the pump. And the fear is that instead of asking car manufacturers, fuel companies to bear the burden of lowering EU emissions, the Commission, by doing this, is putting that burden on society's most vulnerable, and it could result in kind of Gilets jaunes style pushback against this legislation. The key thing to watch with all three of these, obviously energy taxation, that's taxation. But why the Commission doesn't want these other two things to be called taxation is because taxation issues require unanimous approval by all 27 national governments. That means Poland, or anyone else, could veto it. So the Commission, this is going to be tested, I think, with lawyers over the coming months, whether that carbon border adjustment mechanism is a tax and whether the ETS pricing for car emissions and building emissions, that is heat produced in homes, amounts to what is effectively a tax.
Yeah, and you mentioned there that people are concerned about vulnerable elements of society, and I'm just wondering what the Commission's doing to allay those fears.
Yeah, the Commission says they hear these concerns. President von der Leyen was just asked about this right now in the press conference. They are proposing an accompanying social adjustment fund. The idea is that the proceeds from the emissions trading system, trading of allowances for building and car emissions, will go to helping people adjust to this new reality. Now, the details of this, we haven't known until just now. It's just been published. So people are going to be reading this afternoon to see what exactly this is. But Vice President President Timmermans was fairly clear here about what it isn't. That is, it's not going to be a direct check to consumers. People can't write in and say, hey, I've got higher petrol price bills here, and I want the EU to send me a check. That's not what's going to happen. The idea is that the fund is going to go to national programs to help citizens adjust to the new realities here, mainly by buying cleaner cars. I mean, what they want people to do here is to purchase electric cars. And that is, of course, looking forward toward the ban in 2035 from ICEs. Now, the Commission says it's not a ban on internal combustion engines because it just has to, all vehicles have to be zero emission. So you could, in theory, have an internal combustion engine running entirely on alternative fuels, on biofuels, and that would still be okay. Right now, though, that's not technologically feasible. It hasn't been developed. So under existing technology, this does mean a phase out of ICEs by 2035. But who knows? There's been a lot of innovations happening in alternative fuels, and the Commission says this doesn't mean everyone's going to have to give up their cars and switch over to electric cars. It may be that this spurs technical innovation to make ICE vehicles zero emission by that date.
Okay, well, thank you very much for bringing us up to speed. France 24's Dave Keating in Brussels. Thank you.